And joining us now on the debate, in our nation's capital, Mark Cedra, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And with us here in studio, Thabit Abdullah, Professor in the Department of History at York University. And from one of the city's other great universities, the U of T, Mohammed Fadl, Professor in the Faculty of Law, and Sonia Verma, Foreign Affairs Writer for the Globe and Mail. Welcome to you all. We are here for a very timely discussion, that is to talk about the events that are transpiring in Egypt. And I want to start off by taking a look at a still image. This comes from back in February in Tahrir Square. Take a look at this image. There are tens of thousands of people there protesting, hoping that at that time Hosni Mubarak would be leaving. And then now take a look at this image. This is from just earlier this week. Looks pretty similar. Again, tens of thousands of people in Tahrir Square. Sonia Verma, you were in Tahrir Square in late January and February of this year. How did we get to today?
Well, I think the important thing to understand is, of course, with Hosni Mubarak leaving, there was a lot that changed in Egypt. But there was also a lot that stayed the same, in the sense that the military in Egypt has always been the most powerful institution in Egyptian society, in much of the Arab world, to be honest. And they never really relinquished any measure of their power. And they're still sort of, I think, governing with the same mentality a little bit of the Mubarak regime. And of course, the other thing that's happened is that during the past year, there have been some promises made by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the military, or the SCAF, as we like to call them. And some of those promises haven't been fulfilled. You have some very disturbing things happening in terms of human rights, such as military tribunals. So there's something like 12,000 Egyptians that have been pulled in front of these military courts since Mubarak was ousted. And that's more people than were subjected to military trials during his actual rule.
Okay, Thabit, so things haven't really changed on the ground in terms, of a lot of things have stayed the same. So should we be surprised that we see people back in Tahrir Square some 9 months later?
No, I mean, I've appeared on this program many times talking about various aspects of the Middle East, especially Iraq, and I've gotten quite a bit of stick from some of your viewers for always sounding rather optimistic about events there. And the reason I'm optimistic also about Egypt is because I started out with very low expectations here. To me, what I see happening in Egypt is something that is easily predictable. The problems that Egypt faces is not just the presence of Mubarak. It's not. It even goes beyond the military tribunals or the culture of the military council. We have 25% of the youth that are unemployed. Only a couple of days ago, the IMF has warned that Egypt needs an immediate injunction of 10 million jobs just to basically stabilize the situation. There's a very deep ingrained culture going back decades, at least, of corruption, of bribery, and this is not going to disappear very easily. So the struggles we see now is a very natural outcome of the demand for change. And it's also very typical of all revolutions. I mean, don't forget, the French Revolution had to go through Robespierre's terror and Bonaparte's dictatorship before finally achieving some element of the promise of egalitarianism and freedom and fraternity. Which were its primary slogans. So, nothing surprises me here. I'm sure we'll get into the more specifics of the struggles, but these events are not surprising at all.
Okay, Mohammed, but Sonia pointed out that traditionally the Egyptian military has been well respected, at least to some extent, by the people. And back in February, I mean, they were hoisting soldiers on their shoulders, ordinary Egyptians. So is it surprising to you that the military has lost popularity so quickly?
Well, it's not quite clear how much popularity they've lost. I mean, I think that's a matter of contention. Some people suggest there's still large pockets of support for them among the Egyptian population. But the other thing that I would want to caution us from concluding is that we need to separate popularity for the army from popularity from SCAF. It's completely possible that people could support the army, but be against SCAF, right?
How so?
Well, SCAF represents essentially a collective form of Hosni Mubarak. Because in their own view, and I guess in the technical legal view, Hosni Mubarak resigned and appointed SCAF to be the acting president of Egypt. So instead of having a single person as the constitutional president, you have this military council. So the SCAF is acting as the de facto president of Egypt, right? That's different than the army as an institution of the army, right? So it's perfectly plausible for somebody to be opposed to the SCAF because their policies are incompetent, or they might be counter-revolutionary, or whatever, but still have support for the army as a popular institution. When I came on the show before, I think I emphasized the fact that the Egyptian army is a popular institution in the literal sense of the word because it's established through a universal conscription system, and it was the very first universal institution in Egypt. So it's going to have a kind of legitimacy for that reason alone, but that doesn't necessarily translate into legitimacy for the SCAF.
Okay, Mark Sedra, when you look at what's happening in Tahrir Square and beyond, in Alexandria and other cities, I mean, are you seeing this sort of separation between people being angry with SCAF and the military, or what's the message you're hearing from there?
Well, I think people see it what it is. We've seen various measures of the military trying to hold on to power. I think we can't be surprised that we're seeing some counter-revolutionary forces start to emerge. I mean, this is a messy process. You can't emerge from 6 decades of military dictatorship and in less than a year have a fully functioning democracy. However, I think some of the very naked moves of the SCAF to try and hold on to power and to shield itself from oversight in the new Egypt has been very striking. And one of the things that's disappointed me and I think raises some concerns is how the international community, particularly the United States, has stood idly by and watched this with very little complaint. And perhaps that shows that they are in fact keen to see the SCAF remain in charge and shepherd this transition, this messy transition as it moves forward.
Okay, we're going to talk more about what the West is or isn't doing as we move along, but I want to talk about the events that happened yesterday. So yesterday, they say that Kamal Ganzouri is now going to be the prime minister after the civilian government resigned last week. This is a guy that was prime minister back in the 90s under Mubarak. So, you know, at the same time, the military is saying things like, we'll postpone presidential elections, but they'll be 6 months earlier than scheduled. I'm wondering, Thabit, how effective are these concessions that the military is at least trying to make are going to be?
That's left to be seen. Don't forget that the demonstrations that you're talking about now in Tahrir were also accompanied by other demonstrations in the Abbasiyya Square, which were actually quite substantial in favor of the military council, in support of the military council. They were not as large as the Tahrir Square, but quite substantial. I think that this is going to be a struggle that's going to unfold. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to unfold. All that we can talk about now are the contending forces and try to get some estimation of their power. You have the right wing on the one side, usually represented by the Islamist forces. You have the more liberal elements and the left wing, represented primarily by the Tahrir Square demonstrators. And you have the military in between, trying to foster some kind of compromises between the two. And every single one of those 3 elements also suffers from major fissures. I mean, the military itself, as Mohammed mentioned, there's a real generational gap between them, as well as a divide among the ranks. I mean, the junior officers tend to be much more sympathetic with the Tahrir Square demonstrators. Within the Islamist camp, there is the Salafis, which tend to be truly neo-fascistic and less well organized than the Muslim Brotherhood, which is more amenable to some liberal reforms. I think that ultimately what we can best hope for and what will eventually come out in Egypt is some element of greater democratization, some liberalization of the laws, an element of transparency that is perhaps more than it was under the Mubarak regime, with a very strong Islamist coloring, but not necessarily a truly oppressive Islamist regime. I think this is the general direction that the Egyptian revolution is going to, and I don't necessarily think that that's very bad, given what the expectations are.
So to get to democracy, elections need to be held. They're planned for Monday, parliamentary elections. The military council is saying they are going to go ahead. Who here, let's see a show of hands, who here thinks the election should go ahead on Monday? Mark, you're not raising your hand. Oh, Mark's raising his hand.
Raising my hand.
Okay.
I'll raise my hand.
Mohammed's raising it. Mark, let's start with you. Why should they go ahead?
I'm abstaining on this one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I understand the protesters' demands that until the military retreats from political life, that perhaps the election should be delayed. That considering the chaos on the streets right now, but I think at this stage, the momentum is really moving forward. It will be hard, and it could in fact be damaging to the democratic process moving forward if you were to suspend these elections now. I think that once you see that that you start to pick up the momentum, have an elected assembly. Move forward with some of these democratic reforms, constitutional reforms. But of course, the big if is if the military gradually is going to cede power to whether it calls a national salvation government or a national council, similar to what we saw in Tunisia. So I think the election should go forward. But if this democratic process is to be healthy, the military is going to have to take some important and pretty bold steps in the days and months ahead as well.
Can I interject
Go ahead,
just very briefly? I think that's a very obvious position to take, but there is the assumption here that if the elections went ahead on Monday, that they would in fact go ahead in an orderly fashion. And then you can get all these benefits that I think you're talking about. The trouble is, what if they were to take place on Monday and Tuesday, I think as they were now discussing, over 2 days rather than in 1 day, and these demonstrations spin out of control, and there's a big question mark over whether people were able to go to the ballot boxes. This could be truly detrimental. And this is what a lot of the demonstrators in Tahrir Square are saying. They just heard on the news just before coming here that one of the demonstrators saying, how could the military ensure an orderly election if they can't even protect the Ministry of Interior itself?
Sonia.
If I were to answer that, I would say that if you cancel the elections, there's a whole other constituency out there who may even view the demonstrations as stifling their chance for genuine democracy and for actually voting. There is one of the reasons the Muslim Brotherhood is staying partially out is because they have a good chance, well, even though their standing in the poll might be dropping, to have a strong showing. So it could actually increase tensions if you hold back the elections at this time.
Okay, Sonia, given everything that you've heard.
I mean, I think that we have to remember that right now in Egypt, it's a crisis situation. I mean, we have 40 people who have been killed, protesters. We have demonstrations in the streets that seem to be getting bigger and bigger. There are, street battles happening in and around Tahrir Square, in and around the Ministry of the Interior. I feel like there's just no sense of security right now, and that's the widespread perception. Even if these battles aren't happening all across the country, there's this perception of chaos. So my feeling is that any election that takes place on Monday, when there's still sort of horse trading about the details of this election, I mean, those elections are not going to be viewed as legitimate. And I feel like the number one concern of the Egyptians that I've been speaking to over the phone is security. They want a little bit of stability in their country before they move forward with this epic and really momentous process of elections.
But I guess the question then becomes when is a good time to hold elections, because the people in Tahrir Square say they're not going anywhere, Sonia, and the military seems to be bungling this at every step and not making the kinds of concessions that protesters want. So if you don't have a Monday, when do you hold these things?
Well, I guess I just think that the elections are not going to solve that core confrontation. And there has to be another way of solving this confrontation that's just really escalating still, to my mind, before sort of adding in another element. And I understand the debate. I understand the argument in favor of elections. But when I just see what's happening, when I see people, getting shot at, 40 people killed, the security forces using live ammunition, completely, all of these human rights abuses. I mean, I just don't understand how elections can go forward so soon.
I agree with everything Sonia is saying, but I want to say why I think, nevertheless, it's important for the elections to go forward. The biggest reason I think that this transition is stalling is that the revolutionary forces, are unable to come together to present a credible alternative form of civilian government. I think the most important test for whether the transition is successful is if, as Mark was saying, the army gives up power, genuine executive power, to a civilian government. So that's the current demand of the Tahrir protesters, that we're not going anywhere until the SCAF gives up power to a civilian transitional government that has effective authority. The problem with the prior government, of course, was that it was a government on paper. It couldn't do anything. Everything was dependent on the SCAF's approval, and the SCAF was either scared or unwilling or unimaginative enough to do anything, right? So it's sort of a do-nothing 9 months down the drain, okay? And what the advantage of this parliament might be, and even though I'm very skeptical, because under the terms of the SCAF's constitution or constitutional writing process, this parliament will have no jurisdiction to do anything except assist in drafting the new constitution. Now, under the original scheme, the constitution was to be drafted by 100 members of the parliament. Now that's been scaled back to 20, and 80 are going to be appointed by the army. Yeah, I don't know if that's been changed as well in the face of these protests. But the point is, once you have an elected parliament, it seems to me it's possible that you now have an institutional representation for popular forces in Egypt, and they'll be able to coalesce into some sort of concrete vision for the future. Because that's what's keeping people from fully backing the revolution, because they don't know what comes next. Because of the beautiful decentralized nature of this revolution, it's hard for a collective action program to get together. So if you have the elections, now you'll have representatives of the people together, and even if they're not legally mandated to do so, they will be able to form this vision, which is this futuristic vision, which so far has not been formulated. And once that's done, I think Egyptians will be a much better place to sweep away the old regime.
I still think that the underlying issue here for most of the protesters, and for also a lot of the analysts and observers, is the fact that the military will still will not give control to any civilian government. All of the indications show that they're not willing to do that. The SCAF is not willing to relinquish control. So, I take your point in sort of the idea of having these democratically, and then you have the civilian body, but what is the civilian government really, what powers does it have? It has nothing, without the military actually changing its position.
Yeah.
Mark, go ahead.
But I think it's entirely different to have a legitimate elected body. It's one thing for the SCAF to undermine a cabinet that it chose or a bureaucracy, but to have, as imperfect as it may be, to have an elected representatives, I think with a new source of legitimacy, it will be very difficult and I think symbolically dangerous for the SCAF to undermine their authority. And this is going to be a first step. They're to developing a more coherent governance system. It's no matter what, if we're going to be waiting for an entirely stable situation for elections to take place, we're going to be waiting a long time.
Okay, Mohammed, I just want to ask you, before we're going to move on, but I want to ask you, can you vote in these elections?
I did vote.
You did vote.
Yes,
Who'd you vote for?
I voted for Asma Mahfoud and Amr Hamzawi because I'm in Heliopolis. Those were my individual choices, and I voted.
Who do they represent?
I think they're both well-credentialed revolutionary forces. And then I voted as a list, the Egyptian coalition, the revolution continues.
Okay. Thank you for being so honest and telling us who you
I want to make a point, though, here. Right now, the problem in Egypt is institutional paralysis. There is no effective government in Egypt, and Egypt is on the precipice of a major economic crisis. Yeah. So there needs to be some sort of way of moving forward in a way that can confront the forces that are actively trying to undermine this transition. And it's clear that the Ministry of Interior is an active site of subversion. Right? It's not an accident that they were marching toward the Ministry of Interior. Right. They are an active site of subversion, and the interim Minister of Interior was unable to do anything, right?
I want to talk more about the people in Tahrir Square. Take a listen to this quote. This is from earlier this week from the Globe and Mail. Sonia, your newspaper, from your colleague. Here's what was written. This is a quote. "I agree the scenes of brutality are heartbreaking," said Hisham Kassem, the former head of the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights. "But the assaults are not sufficient reason to derail the orderly transition to elected civilian authority. These people in Tahrir do not represent the people of Egypt or even the 25 million expected to vote," he said. "If the army did put this to a referendum, it would win overwhelmingly," he added. Here we are again debating who the people in Tahrir Square are and who they are representing. Are they representing a broad spectrum of Egyptians? Tabit.
Well, ideally, in my estimation, probably the way the military should have handled this is immediately after the removal of Mubarak, they should have quickly moved toward a referendum on their position. And do the people of Egypt agree that the military council should run affairs and prepare for the parliamentary elections? That would have given them much more legitimacy. And then the criticisms against the military that we see now would have been handled very differently. This didn't happen. In terms of the Tahrir Square people now, currently, not with the first uprising, I think they represent specifically the liberal democratic left-wing coalition, because the Islamists have boycotted these demonstrations. The Salafis do flirt with them, actually. There's an element of the Salafis that has joined, but the general makeup of this is the liberal democratic group.
Sonia, do you agree with that? You've been talking to people in Egypt. Is what's going on in Tahrir Square a bellwether for broader Egyptian society?
Well, I think that, I mean, it's true the Muslim Brotherhood are not involved in these processes. A big difference from what was happening last January. In terms of the broader, I mean, you know, I think that the protests that we're seeing in Tahrir Square are so directed against the military. What it doesn't reflect is some of the other concerns and issues that are really paramount in other Egyptians' minds, such as the economic concerns that Mohammed mentioned earlier. I mean, this is a big problem. You know, people are you know, zero growth in the country, zero tourism, no investment, no clear path forward. That's a big concern for a lot of Egyptians who might not necessarily be in Tahrir Square. I think that Egyptians probably sympathize with the aims, the democratic aims of these protesters, even if they're not out there in the streets. But my sense is that there are a number of Egyptians who are sick of seeing protests. They are sick of seeing, you know, violence. They are sick of seeing their country in chaos, and they want to move on somehow. So I think that perhaps, and even some politicians actually, I interviewed Najib Sawiris, who's not a politician himself, but is a supporter of a secular movement. He was also saying that he's very frustrated with some of the young protesters, because he says, you know, these people have been protesting for a year now, and I want them to join the political process so that we can move forward. Yet they're not. You know, they still return to Tahrir Square. So there is a sense of, I think, frustration, and it's not sort of one monolithic voice of the Egyptian people that we're seeing. It's sort of one subsection.
Okay, we will talk more about Najib Sawiris going ahead, and I know he's a very controversial figure, but Mohammed, I want to stay focused on Tahrir Square and these protesters that are there. You know, Thabit said earlier that, you know, democracy takes a long time to establish. Are these people naive that in 9 months you could go from 30 years of dictatorship to full-blown democracy?
I don't think their demands are naive or utopian. I don't think they're expecting Egypt to, as I've said before, bloom into Canada overnight. But what they are demanding is effective civilian oversight of this process.
But in 9 months to get
No,
there?
but all you're talking about is an effective civilian interim government that does not answer to the military, right? Because if we're trying to establish a democratic government in Egypt, that means at a minimum that the government is that the military will be answerable to the people, not the other way around, not the people answerable to the army, right? And I think what has happened is that in the last 9 months, the SCAF has shown itself either to be an agent of the counter-revolution or incapable of confronting counter-revolutionary forces, right? Or just simply incompetent, maybe a combination of all three. And so, and again, what experience has shown us is that only demonstrations caused the SCAF to make concessions. And to people who are skeptical of the representative character, I say this: if they truly were so marginal to Egyptian society, I have no doubt that they would have been crushed like so many insects, right? The fact is, they may be numerically small as a percentage of the population of Egypt, but I think they represent the hopes of Egyptians, right? Not only do they represent the hopes of Egyptians, they are actually part of the productive classes of Egypt. And again, you can look, if you're interested in an economic analysis of this revolution, it's the working classes and the upper middle classes, people who have a lot of human capital, whose human capital is being destroyed by the incompetence and the corruption of the regime. And they're saying that unless there's radical change, this country's going to collapse, and they're right. I mean, what we know for a fact is neo-authoritarianism in Egypt will certainly fail. They might not succeed, but at least there's a chance they would succeed.
Sonia, you talked to Najib Sawiris last week. You interviewed him. He's the Egyptian billionaire, head of Wind Telecom as well. I want to read a little bit more about from your interview with him. Here's what part of that interview said. The whole West, from Mr. Obama to Mr. Cameron to Mr. Sarkozy, are just watching this so-called Arab Spring as bystanders. There's chaos now. The hotels are empty. The stock exchange has crashed. Our reserves are depleting, and you have the threat of this whole area turning into another Iran. If you ask me what the West should have done, they should have come to us and helped us out. Mark, Sawiris argues that, Qatar is funding the Muslim Brotherhood to the tune of $100 million, and the West should be doing the same thing, get involved, actively involved in Egypt. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it should get involved, and it should be concerned with what it's seeing. I think that it now seems quite plausible that there are elements within the Obama administration, for instance, that see the military as holding that guardian, Praetorian role for Egypt going forward, similar to how the Turkish military's role in Turkey, in recent years prior to the current government coming to power. So I think that clearly they see the U.S. administration sees that as a stabilizing force. However, I think it's dangerous talking about the West and the United States starting to spend money to influence the political process. There's already talk in the Egyptian media about interference by the United States by supporting certain civil society groups, and that's actually stirring up anti-Western sentiment. So I think they have to strategically look at how they can work. I think one way is to use U.S. military aid, which is at around the level of $1.3 billion per year, which is about 25% of the budget of the Egyptian military. Use that to try and incentivize some change and to push the Egyptian military to transfer power to civilian rule. But I think it's dangerous when you try and influence directly the electoral or the political process.
Yeah, well, Western intervention, I mean, that term is dangerous to even say out loud in lots of parts of the world.
It's very toxic. I think it's very toxic. They have to be extremely careful. And I'm glad Mark mentioned that the Egyptian military already gets enormous amount of financial aid. He mentioned over $1 billion. I would really be skeptical that that money is going in without any kind of political influence. I'm sure that there is an element of political influence there, and it is being felt. Likewise, the American aid toward the very active NGOs, which are often the base of many of the liberal democratic forces now in Tahrir Square, very often get their money through donors from the West. So there is a Western influence in this, no doubt. I think in general, though, the West and the United States should have a single criteria in terms of support, and that is to effectively resist and to condemn any group that espouses violence. Other than that, they really should be quite open and have a hands-off here. In this manner, even an Islamist group, given the mood of Egypt and the Arab world in general, to simply single out Islamic groups as being very dangerous and fascistic and so forth. I mean, I don't support these Islamist groups, but I think to single them out as being dangerous to the West, as being neo-fascistic, is not going to wash with anybody.
Mohammed, go ahead.
I think Mr. Sawiris, excuse the term, has a lot of chutzpah. I mean, the man's a billionaire. He could certainly finance multiple political parties in Egypt if he wanted to. I don't know why he needs the United States. He's got billions of dollars. Why doesn't he underwrite the campaigns? I just mentioned two people that I voted for, Asmat Mahfouz and Amr Hamzawi. They are out there campaigning. There are lots of Egyptians from the younger generation who participated in the revolution who are running for office. I think it's completely slanderous to say that they're not interested in the hard work of politics. I think what is true is that they want a kind of future Egypt, a new economic and social order that he may not be particularly sympathetic to. I mean, look, he became a billionaire multiple times over during the Mubarak regime. You know, he probably had a lot of sympathies for the old way of doing things. And I'm not sure he's necessarily very sympathetic to the kinds of social changes that the revolution wants to bring around.
Sonia, let's leave Sawiris aside.
I do have to just say, though,
I knew you were going to jump in.
Because I do want to make clear, he actually is funding a lot of the political parties and some of the secular political parties. And the one thing about Mr. Sawiris that I respect at the end of the day is that he is at least still in Egypt. And he makes this point himself. There were a lot of billionaires that left Egypt, and I think that we do have to give him credit for at least staying and for raising his voice, for speaking to the media, and for also helping, to some extent, finance some of these secular political parties.
Okay, where can the West make inroads? Where should they be going?
I think that it's infuriating to Egyptians to have the West not say anything, and that's really the perception, I think, in Tahrir Square right now, that the West sort of gives these sort of anodyne comments about, do we support the military? Do we support, the civilians? The strongest statement I think that was made was about, I think, both sides exercising restraint. That's not the kind of thing that puts them on, like, the quote right side of history. They need to make a strong statement, I think, about the respect of human rights, to oppose violence, and I think that will actually increase their credibility and their clout in that part of the world, because at the moment, there's this deep distrust of the West. I mean, the IMF tried to, I think, float a loan to Egypt. I believe it was in the summer, and the Egyptians said, no, we don't want it. We're not interested in it. So there's a distrust, and we can't underestimate the effect of that, I think, moving forward.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, and we cannot wrap up this discussion without talking about the Muslim Brotherhood. Mark, given what's been happening this past week, where does the Muslim Brotherhood sit today, going into potentially elections on Monday anyway?
Well, I mean, from some of the polls that we've seen, they poll anywhere between 20 and 30%. They are one of the best organized parties, despite the repression under the Mubarak regime. It has a solid constituency. But I think, again, as has already been said, the hold that Islamist groups have in Egyptian society is overstated in the West, and those fears are overstated in the West. But nonetheless, they will have a good standing in parliamentary elections when they are held.
What are we talking about?
What's interesting,
number-wise?
Well, I mean, we're talking perhaps 20 to 30% of the votes.
I've heard.
However,
I've heard much
yes.
higher. I've heard it could even go up to 50%, depending on the conditions in which the elections are held.
One of the interesting things, however, is even some of the interesting, some of the polling that I've seen in the Egyptian press has indicated actually that they might have even taken a hit because of their lack of participation in the protests. That one Egyptian pollster I read said that they may be even up to 10%. So I think that I don't think they're going to get up to 50%, but I think that they'll still have a strong showing nonetheless.
Mohammed, Mark's talking about the Brotherhood not counseling people to go to Tahrir Square. They didn't say don't go. They said it's up to individuals. Was that a misstep on their part? And is that going to hurt them moving forward?
It's very hard to say from the perspective of practical politics, because there is a large constituency in Egypt that is for the revolution happened, let's move forward, let's get stability, right? So I think they believe that in terms of at least short-term popular politics, and that they're going to get a lot of support from the stability constituency in Egypt. I'm not in Egypt. I don't know. I don't do polling. But as far as the long term goes, my view is that the representatives of Tahrir, the people who are in Tahrir, including, by the way, lots of individual members of the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic movements, are there as individuals, that they actually, I think, are much more in tune with the long term opinion of Egyptians, right?
Okay.
And so that's the dilemma, short-term, long-term.
We're running out of time, but I want to just quickly go around the table, maybe not so quickly, and ask this question. This year has been about seeing people power on the streets of the Arab world. But I want to start with you. In Egypt, how much do ordinary people going forward have an influence on what really happens now?
Well, I think they have much more than they had before the Arab Spring, and that in itself is a wonderful gain. It's also something that develops into a habit. And if this then can be translated into elections, I think the Arab world would have moved quite significantly forward. That's why I'm optimistic about this change.
Mark Sedra, people power still on the move?
Absolutely, and I think we're still going to see the events of Tahrir Square continue to reverberate across the region and even the world, and especially if places like Egypt and Syria can overcome these counter-revolutionary forces. I think that's going to give a further boost and some momentum to revolutionary change in other countries.
Mohammed Fadel, when does the military government give up power to a civilian authority?
I think in 6 months, as soon as there's a financial crisis, they're going to have to give up power.
Okay, Sonia, you get the last word.
What to say? I think that, no, I mean, I think that obviously, I think that what we're seeing in Tahrir Square is a cause for hope and optimism again. I mean, I think that when I look at the Egyptian military, I guess I'm pessimistic about them being on a 6-month timeline. But I do think that, you can't underestimate, as we've seen all year, the power of the people.
Okay, thanks everyone for this. Mark Sedra, thank you very much, joining
Thank
us
you.
from Ottawa, from CG. And here in studio, Sonia Verma, Foreign Affairs writer with the Globe and Mail. And on my other side, Mohammed Fadl from the University of Toronto, and from York University, Thabit Abdullah. Thank you very much, everyone.